The Hells Angels biker found the little girl staring at a cracked blueprint, and its symbols led to unspoken crimes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind howled through the alley as Jake Morrison, a rugged Hells Angels biker with a history of violence and redemption, cruised down the empty streets of the old town. His Harley-Davidson's engine rumbled like thunder as it cut through the cold air, and he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with every ride. But this night was different. The streetlights flickered as Jake noticed something strange, an old, cracked blueprint pinned to the wall of an abandoned building. It was poorly lit, but the glow from his headlamp illuminated the details just enough for him to see symbols and markings that looked oddly familiar. As he pulled his bike to a stop, curiosity gnawed at him. He got off and stepped closer, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The blueprint looked ancient, its edges worn and fragile, but what caught his eye were the symbols. They were like nothing he'd seen before, cryptic, intricate, as if they told a story he wasn't ready to understand. Standing there in the cold, he heard a rustling from behind a dumpster. His instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. As he approached, he froze. A little girl, no older than 10, was crouched down in the shadows, staring at the blueprint. Her eyes wide with wonder and fear. She didn't notice him at first. She was trembling, her small hands gripping the edges of the paper as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her breath was visible in the air, a sign of the bitter cold she had been exposed to for far too long. Jake's heart sank. He had seen the damage that people could do, but this little girl, alone in the dark, was something he couldn't ignore. "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here?" Jake's voice was gruff, but there was a softness to it as he knelt beside her. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes filled with fear. She flinched, expecting him to yell, to hurt her, but instead, she saw something in his gaze that made her hesitate. He wasn't here to harm her. I was just looking at the map," she whispered, her voice shaky. "My mom says it's a map to something important." Jake's mind raced. This was no ordinary blueprint, and certainly no ordinary child. "Your mom?" he asked, kneeling down beside her, trying to hide the concern in his voice. The girl looked away, her eyes darting nervously. "She told me to find the symbols. She said they would lead us to something safe." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't know who this child's mother was, but he knew that whatever this was, it was bigger than they both realized. Something told him this blueprint was tied to more than just an old building. It was connected to a secret that had been buried for years, one that had the potential to change everything. But as he looked at the girl, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope. She was just a kid, caught in a web of something she couldn't understand. "Do you know what these symbols mean?" he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The girl shook her head, her fingers brushing over the paper. "I think they're warnings," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Warnings about bad people." Jake's eyes narrowed. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there was still so much he didn't know. What was this blueprint leading to? And why had it fallen into the hands of a little girl? As Jake studied the symbols, he felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. This wasn't just a coincidence. There was something hidden in these markings, something that connected to the dark past he had tried so hard to forget. And now, he was tangled in it, whether he liked it or not. He stood up, pulling the girl to her feet. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice steady. "Stay close to me, all right?" The little girl nodded, still clutching the blueprint. As they walked away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. The truth was far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. As Jake and the little girl made their way down the desolate street, the weight of the blueprint felt heavier with each step. The night air was thick with a cold mist, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots against the frost-covered pavement. The girl, still holding the cracked blueprint tightly in her small hands, glanced up at Jake with a look that was part fear, part determination. She had said it was a map to something safe, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this map was more than just a means to find shelter. It felt like it was leading them straight into a storm they were not prepared for. They reached his motorcycle, and he helped her onto the back, keeping his eyes on the dark alley behind them. He knew they couldn't stay out in the open for long. The bike roared to life as Jake revved the engine and sped off into the night. They headed for the outskirts of town, where the streets were quieter, the houses farther apart, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. But even as they rode through the quiet, Jake couldn't rid himself of the gnawing feeling that they were being followed. Every turn he made, every glance in the rearview mirror, only fueled his suspicion. The girl, sitting behind him, seemed lost in thought, but there was a heaviness to her silence that made Jake uneasy. He'd seen a lot in his life, and he could tell when someone was hiding something. And right now, this girl was hiding more than just the mystery of that blueprint. As they passed a few more houses, Jake took a sharp turn onto a side street and slowed down. He knew exactly where he was going. The old garage he had been working out of for the past year was tucked away behind a row of trees. It was the kind of place that didn't attract attention, just a small, forgotten building, a relic from another time. The place had been his sanctuary ever since he left the club, a place to find peace, to clear his head, and to work on the motorcycles that still called to him. But tonight, it felt like the calm. Before the storm, he parked the bike near the garage and helped the girl off, then quickly ushered her inside. As the door creaked open, the smell of motor oil and old wood filled the air. The space was sparse, just a few tools, some broken furniture, and stacks of motorcycle parts scattered about. It wasn't much, but it was his. He locked the door behind them and flicked on the light. The girl looked around, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She was clearly uneasy, but she didn't say anything. Jake walked over to a small table where he had a first aid kit and began to clean his hands. His mind was racing. There was something about this girl, something about the blueprint, that didn't sit right. He had learned long ago that the world didn't give you things for free. It always took something in return. And this time, it felt like the cost would be high. "What's your name?" Jake asked, finally breaking the silence. The girl hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she could trust him with the answer. But then, after a beat, she spoke. "Lily," she said softly. Jake nodded, his hands still working on the first aid kit. "Lily, huh?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "That's a nice name." She nodded, then glanced back at the blueprint she still held tightly in her hands. "Do you know what these symbols mean?" Jake asked, his voice low, trying not to show his growing concern. Lily looked down at the map, her small fingers tracing the symbols. "I think they are directions," she said quietly. "To something hidden." Jake paused, his heart skipped a beat. Something hidden. The words felt like a warning. He had seen too many people searching for things they couldn't handle. The question was, what was Lily searching for? And more importantly, why did she think this map, this blueprint, had the answers? Jake sat down across from her, his gaze fixed on the map. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew one thing for sure. The answers they were looking for wouldn't come easily. "What did your mother tell you about this map?" he asked, trying to piece together the fragments of the story. Lily hesitated, then looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "She said it was the only way to find what we lost," she whispered. Jake's brow furrowed. What did she mean by that? Lily's voice dropped to a near whisper. "She said it was a way to protect us, but I don't understand. She never explained it fully." Jake leaned back, his mind turning over the few details he had. This wasn't just about a blueprint. It was about something deeper, something hidden away for years. And Lily was at the center of it all. Just as he was about to ask her more questions, there was a loud knock at the door. Jake froze. His instincts flared. Someone knew they were here. The knock at the door startled both Jake and Lily, sending a sharp tension through the air. Jake's instincts flared immediately. He stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather jacket that hung by the door. The garage, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. He moved toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. His eyes scanned the street outside, his heart pounding. No one was in sight, but the unease gnawing at him wouldn't go away. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Jake, we know you're in there." The voice was gruff, familiar, and it sent a chill down his spine. It was Steele, a former brother from his Hells Angels days, now a part of a faction Jake had severed ties with. Steele had a way of showing up when Jake least expected it, usually with bad news. "Open up, Jake," We need to talk, Steele called out. Jake glanced over at Lily, who was huddled on the couch, clutching the cracked blueprint tightly to her chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. Jake knew he had to protect her, but dealing with Steele was never simple. Steele wasn't here for casual conversation. He was here for something. And Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever that something was. Stay here, Jake said, his voice low but firm. He stepped toward the door, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His hand rested on the doorknob, but for a moment, he hesitated. What if Steele wasn't alone? What if this was all a setup? He had no idea who Steele might be working with now. He opened the door just enough to peek through the crack. Steele stood on the other side, his broad frame filling the doorway. He was flanked by two other bikers, both wearing the same Hell's Angels patches Jake had worn in his past life. What do you want, Steele? Jake asked, his voice steady but with an edge. Steele's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, urgent. We need that map, Jake, Steele said, his voice low. The one you're hiding. Jake's stomach sank. The blueprint. The symbols on it. He hadn't told Steele anything about it, and yet, Steele knew. You're wasting your time, Jake replied, his hand tightening on the door. I don't know what you're talking about. Steele's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Don't lie to me, Jake. We know the little girl has it. We know you've got it hidden somewhere here. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Lily. Steele had found out about her. He had to think quickly. You've got no right to come here and make demands, Jake said, trying to buy some time. Steele leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't understand. This isn't about you anymore. It's bigger than the club. It's about something that could change everything. Jake's grip on the door tightened. Steele wasn't playing games. He could see it in his eyes. This was more than a simple power grab. It was a warning. But what did it have to do with Lily? And why was it so important to Steele? You've got no idea what you're getting into, Jake said, his voice low but firm. Steele sighed, clearly losing patience. Jake, open the door. We're not leaving without it. He stepped back, signaling to the two bikers with him. You've got until sundown. Jake slammed the door shut, his mind racing. He turned to Lily, whose wide eyes were fixed on him, waiting for an explanation. We need to move, Jake said quickly. Now. Lily didn't say anything, but the fear in her eyes was enough to tell Jake that she understood. They weren't safe anymore. Jake grabbed his jacket, slipping it on, then turned to the corner of the garage where he kept his emergency gear. He pulled out a duffel bag, stuffing it with a few essentials, some cash, a couple of guns, and the spare set of keys to the bike. He had no idea how much time they had, but he knew they couldn't stay here. Not with Steele and his crew looking for them. Come on, Jake said, grabbing Lily by the arm and leading her out the back door. We've got to go. Now. They moved quickly through the back alley, avoiding the main roads. Jake's mind was racing. He needed to figure out who else might be involved, and why this blueprint mattered so much. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a map. It was about something far darker, and it wasn't going to stop until they found out what it was. As they made their way through the streets, Jake kept his head down, staying in the shadows as much as possible. He glanced over at Lily, who was holding onto his side tightly. Don't worry, he muttered, though even he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. We're going to figure this out. Together. The sound of distant engines echoed through the streets, and Jake's pulse quickened. They were being hunted, and soon, they would be forced to confront whatever lay at the heart of this mystery. They moved through the shadows, careful not to draw attention as they made their way through the dimly lit streets. Jake kept his head down, his eyes scanning their surroundings. The distant hum of engines, getting closer with each passing minute, reminded him that they were being hunted. The sound of tires on wet asphalt, the low growl of powerful engines. Steele and his crew were closing in, and Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they found them. He kept moving, Lily close behind, her small form darting between the alleyways as they avoided the main roads. The rain had started to fall heavier, the cold droplets soaking through their clothes, but Jake barely noticed. His focus was on one thing, survival. He couldn't let them get to Lily. He wouldn't let them. We need to find somewhere to hide, Jake muttered, his voice grim. Lily nodded silently, still clutching the cracked blueprint in her hands. It had been a few hours since the confrontation at the garage, and Jake could tell she was exhausted. But there was something else in her eyes, a spark of determination, even though the fear was still there. She had no idea what she was really caught up in, but Jake could see it in her, that same instinct to protect. He was going to keep her safe. That was the only thing that mattered now. They turned another corner, and Jake spotted a small, run-down diner on the corner. It was a place that didn't attract attention, the kind of place where people came and went without a second glance. It was perfect. Jake made his way toward the back entrance and quickly pushed the door open. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, just a few people sitting at the counter, their faces illuminated by the dull light from the neon sign outside. The waitress behind the counter barely glanced up as Jake and Lily entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tired but friendly. Jake gave her a quick nod, stepping to the counter with Lily close behind him. "We need a place to lay low for a bit," Jake said, his voice calm but urgent. The waitress looked them over for a moment, then motioned to a booth in the corner. "You can sit there," she said, then walked away without another word. Jake and Lily slid into the booth, and Jake immediately glanced out the window. He could see the headlights of cars passing by, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay low," Jake whispered to Lily as he pulled the hood of his jacket up over his head, trying to blend in. Lily nodded, her small hands still clutching the blueprint. Jake's mind raced. What was so important about that map? Why had Steele and his crew come looking for it? And more importantly, why had Lily's mother given it to her? He thought back to the conversation they had earlier, when Lily mentioned her mother's cryptic words about finding something to protect them. Could this blueprint really lead to some kind of protection? Or was it something darker? Jake knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let anyone else get their hands on it. "Jake!" Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked over at her, and for the first time, saw the full weight of her fear. Her small face was pale, and her eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "Now we wait, and we figure out what this map is all about." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but it was the only thing he could say to keep her calm. The minutes stretched on, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder, and he could feel the tension in the air thickening. He kept his eyes trained on the diner's front door, waiting for any sign that Steele or his men were close. But instead of the sound of footsteps approaching, Jake heard something else. A distant siren. Then another. And another. The flashing lights of a police car could be seen through the window, and Jake's pulse quickened. "It's them," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "We need to move." Lily looked up at him, fear creeping into her expression. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The people who are after us," Jake said, his voice low. He grabbed her arm gently but firmly, guiding her toward the back door. They weren't safe here. They had to keep moving. As they exited through the back of the diner, the sirens grew louder. Jake pulled Lily along, his mind racing. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind them now, heavy and quick. They were closing in. Jake turned a corner and looked for a way to lose them. He spotted an old storage building, its rusty metal doors barely hanging on their hinges. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. They dashed inside, the cold air hitting them as the door creaked shut behind them. Inside, the building was dark, with only a few faint glimmers of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he looked around, trying to come up with a plan. But there was no time. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They had to stay hidden, and they had to figure out what the blueprint really meant before it was too late. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Jake's pulse raced. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Lily was close behind him, her small hand gripping his jacket tightly. The old storage building was silent except for the occasional creak of the rusted metal beams. He couldn't hear the sirens anymore, but he knew they were still out there. The footsteps were growing louder, and they weren't alone anymore. Jake could sense their presence, the unmistakable tension in the air, the way it thickened with each passing second. Steele's men were getting closer. They had tracked them here, and there was nowhere to run. He looked at Lily, her face pale under the dim light. "Stay close," Jake whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't need to say more. She was scared, but Jake could see that she was still trying to be brave. Her grip tightened on his jacket as if she was trying to hold onto some semblance of safety. But Jake knew the truth. They weren't safe anywhere. The sound of the footsteps stopped. They were close. Jake's eyes darted around the dark storage room, looking for anything that could help. There was nothing but old boxes and forgotten equipment. Nothing useful. His mind raced. What were they after? What was so important about the blueprint? Jake's heart skipped a beat as the answer hit him. It wasn't just a map. It was a key to something that could destroy everything. He could feel the weight of it, the power that came with it. He wasn't just trying to protect Lily anymore. He was trying to protect the world from whatever this blueprint led to. The sound of voices broke his train of thought. Steele's men had found their way inside. Jake's mind shifted into overdrive. He grabbed Lily's arm gently but firmly. "We need to move. Now," he said, his voice urgent. He pulled her toward the back of the building, away from the main entrance. They needed to get out of sight, and they needed to do it fast. As they slipped deeper into the shadows, Jake's mind raced. He knew that Steele and his men wouldn't stop. They were in too deep now, and whatever they were looking for, they would do anything to get their hands on it. Jake wasn't sure how much time they had, but he knew that the longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. They needed to get out, and they needed to do it before Steele's crew realized they were gone. They reached the back of the storage building, where an old fire exit door sat ajar. Jake hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. It creaked loudly, and Jake winced at the sound. The last thing they needed was to draw attention. He motioned for Lily to follow him as he stepped outside into the cold night air. The alley was narrow and dark, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. Jake kept his pace steady, trying to remain as quiet as possible. They needed to blend in, to disappear. "Jake," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Why do they want the map?" Jake glanced down at her. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I promise you, I won't let them get it. We'll be okay." It was a lie. He didn't know if they would be okay, but he had to say something to calm her down. They kept moving, and Jake's mind raced. The blueprint, the symbols on it, they were connected to something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Steele and his men were just the beginning. There was a much larger web of people involved, and Jake had no idea how deep it went. All he knew was that they couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. They reached the end of the alley and paused. Jake's eyes scanned the street ahead. It was empty, but the night felt heavy with anticipation. He knew they couldn't stay on the streets for long. The longer they were out in the open, the more likely they were to be spotted. He had to find a way to lose them, and fast. Jake pulled Lily close to him, his grip tightening. He needed to think. What was their next move? He didn't have the luxury of planning anymore. The sound of engines revving broke through his thoughts. It was them. Steele and his crew were getting closer. Jake could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He couldn't outrun them, not on foot, and they didn't have enough time to find a safer place. "This way," Jake said, pulling Lily toward a narrow side street. They sprinted down the street, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short bursts as they rounded the corner. He was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion, but he couldn't stop now. They were too close. The alley led to a small parking lot, and Jake spotted an old, rusted van at the far end. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get them out of here. "Get in the van," Jake said. Lily didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the passenger seat, and Jake slammed the door shut behind her. He jumped into the driver's seat, cranking the engine to life. The van sputtered, but it roared to life on the second try. Jake slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching as they tore out of the parking lot. The chase was on. Steele and his men weren't far behind, but Jake had one advantage. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. He swerved around corners, cutting through side streets, doing everything he could to shake their pursuit. But with every turn, every twist, he could feel the pressure building. They had to stay ahead. They couldn't afford to get caught. The van lurched forward, tires screeching against the cracked pavement as Jake slammed the accelerator. The engine roared, and the rusted old van barely held together under the strain. In the rearview mirror, the headlights of Steele's crew flashed like a looming shadow. They were close, too close. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel as he swerved to avoid a pothole, the van bouncing violently. Lily was clutching the seat beside her, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't outrun them, can we?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake didn't answer immediately. He focused on the road ahead, his mind racing through possibilities. He knew the streets better than anyone, but Steele's men had fast bikes, and they weren't about to give up the chase. "Just hang on," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "We're not stopping until we lose them." The van rattled as they sped through a series of sharp turns. The engine coughed and sputtered, but it kept running, barely. The city was coming alive around them, the streets busier now with late-night drivers and pedestrians. Jake glanced at Lily. She was trying to keep calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. The blueprint was still clutched tightly in her hands. She hadn't let go of it once, not even in the chaos of the chase. "We need to find somewhere safe," Jake muttered under his breath. "A place to regroup, figure out our next move." Lily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Where do we go? How do we get away from them?" "We'll figure it out," Jake said, though he wasn't sure how. His mind was working, weighing every option. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Steele would catch up eventually, and then they'd be out of options. But where could they hide? The answer came to him like a flash of inspiration, his old mechanic shop on the edge of town. It was a place Steele would never expect. It was isolated, hidden from view, and most importantly, it was a place Jake knew inside and out. He could make it work. "We're going to the shop," Jake said, determination in his voice. "Hold on tight." He took a hard turn onto a narrower street, heading towards the outskirts of the city. The headlights of Steele's men were still visible in the distance, but they were starting to fall behind. Jake pushed the van harder, praying it would hold together long enough to get them there. As they neared the shop, Jake's heart raced. He could already see the faint outline of the building in the distance. It was barely visible from the main road, tucked away behind a row of trees. If they could just make it there, they'd be safe for a little while. He glanced over at Lily, who was still gripping the seat with white knuckles. "We're almost there," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. The van made a sharp turn down a dirt road, and the headlights from Steele's crew were nowhere to be seen. Jake breathed a sigh of relief. They had a lead. For now. The van creaked as they pulled up to the shop. It was an old building, run down and covered in dust, but it was home to Jake. He parked the van in the back, far out of sight from the road. "Stay here," Jake said as he quickly got out of the van. He moved toward the back entrance of the shop, his heart still racing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had to get off the grid, and they had to do it fast. Inside, the shop was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. It smelled of oil, grease, and metal. Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him as he stepped inside. This was his world. This was where he could think, where he could plan. He quickly pulled out a small toolbox and grabbed a few tools, ready to secure the place. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the blueprint. What did it all mean? The symbols, the markings, the hidden messages. It was all connected to something bigger, something dangerous. And Lily was caught in the middle of it. He had to protect her. But how? He didn't have all the answers, and the clock was ticking. The sound of a distant engine brought him back to reality. Steele and his crew weren't far behind. Jake glanced at the window, watching for any movement. "Lily," he called out, turning to the back of the van. "Stay here. I'm going to make sure they don't find us." He grabbed a few more tools and headed to the back door. It was time to make a stand. The building was old, but it had its secrets. Hidden compartments, escape routes, things that Jake had set up for emergencies like this. He was going to use every inch of this place to keep them safe. As he moved through the darkened shop, he thought about the choices that had led him here. Leaving the club had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. But protecting Lily was more important than any loyalty to a brotherhood that had long since abandoned him. He couldn't afford to fail now. Lily was depending on him. Jake pulled a large metal box from under the workbench. It was heavy, but he didn't hesitate. He opened it, revealing an old firearm and a few spare magazines. He wasn't planning to fight, but he had to be prepared. Steele's men weren't going to give up easily. They would keep coming. Jake took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the next step. He had to hold his ground and figure out what the blueprint was really about. And most importantly, he had to keep Lily safe. As he secured the shop and made his way back to the van, he felt a surge of determination. They weren't out of danger yet, but he was ready to do whatever it took to protect the only thing that mattered now, Lily. The air was thick with tension as Jake crouched near the back of the shop, his eyes scanning the streets outside. The sound of engines had grown faint, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Steele and his men were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside the old building, the only sound was the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of the shop's aging structure. Lily was in the van, hidden from view, her face pale but determined. Jake had told her to stay inside, but he knew she was scared. He couldn't blame her. This was the kind of life that changed a person, that twisted them into someone they didn't recognize. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He had to make a plan. He had to keep her safe. As he looked out the window, Jake's mind raced. The blueprint, the symbols, the markings, it was all connected to something bigger, something dangerous. Steele and his men weren't just interested in the map. They were after the secrets it held, secrets that could unravel everything. And Jake had no idea how deep it all went. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. He froze, his body tensing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They were close, but Jake couldn't see them yet. His heart raced. Were they back already? He quickly moved toward the back of the shop, slipping into the shadows. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use to protect them. He didn't have much, but he had to work with what he had. The old shop was cluttered with tools and machinery, a mess of forgotten projects and half-finished bikes. But amidst the chaos, Jake spotted something that could help, a large metal cabinet, one he had used for storing spare parts and tools. He pulled it open and grabbed the first thing he could find, an old crowbar. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he stood there, holding the crowbar in his hands, the door to the shop creaked open. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could hear voices now, muffled but unmistakable. Steele's men had arrived. He glanced at the back door. If he could make it out undetected, they might have a chance. But the voices were growing louder. They were close. Far too close. Jake knew he didn't have much time. He moved swiftly, positioning himself behind a stack of old tires. He had to be ready. He had to act fast. The door creaked open wider, and Steele's voice rang out, cold and familiar. "Jake, we know you're in there. Come out, and we can make this easy. We just want the map." Jake's grip tightened on the crowbar. He wasn't going down without a fight. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The time for running was over. If they wanted the map, they would have to take it from him. He moved quietly, positioning himself near the back of the shop, where the shadows were thickest. His eyes never left the door. He was waiting for the perfect moment. Steele's voice came again, louder this time. "Jake, don't make this harder than it has to be. You know what we want. Hand over the blueprint, and no one has to get hurt." Jake's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to hand over the map. Not now, not ever. They would have to pry it from his cold, dead hands first. The door opened wider, and two men stepped inside, their boots echoing against the concrete floor. Jake's eyes narrowed as they moved further into the shop, their eyes scanning the room. They were looking for him, and they were about to find him. The moment was now. Jake sprang into action, rushing forward with the crowbar raised. He swung it with all his might, catching one of the men off guard. The crowbar connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The other man shouted, but Jake didn't stop. He swung again, knocking the second man to the ground. The first man regained his footing and reached for his gun, but Jake was faster. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from his hand and slamming him into a stack of metal tools. The man grunted, trying to push Jake off, but Jake held firm, pinning him down. "You want the map?" Jake growled. "You'll have to kill me first." The man struggled beneath him, but Jake wasn't giving up. He could hear the sounds of footsteps approaching, more men coming from the outside. Jake knew this wouldn't end here. They would keep coming until they got what they wanted. And he wasn't about to let that happen. He had to protect Lily. He had to protect the blueprint. The man beneath him stopped struggling, realizing that Jake wasn't backing down. Jake lifted the crowbar, ready to strike again, but then he heard a voice from the doorway. "Jake, stop." It was Lily's voice. Jake froze, his body tensing. He turned toward her, his heart racing. Lily was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't hurt them," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep fighting." Jake's grip on the crowbar loosened, but he didn't lower it. He couldn't. Not yet. The sound of more footsteps echoed from outside. Steele and his crew were getting closer. Jake turned back to the man beneath him, his eyes cold. "We're not done yet," he said, before looking back at Lily. "Get to the van. Now." Lily hesitated, but Jake's tone left no room for argument. She turned and ran toward the van, leaving Jake to face the growing threat. He knew they were running out of time, but this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Jake watched Lily run toward the van, his heart pounded. The footsteps outside grew louder, and he could hear the unmistakable sound of Steele's crew closing in. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he knew the time for hesitation was over. Steele and his men were here, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Jake wasn't about to let them get away with it. Not this time. He grabbed the man he had pinned to the ground, throwing him aside with a grunt. The man struggled to stand, but Jake was already moving, rushing toward the back of the shop. He needed to get to Lily. He needed to get her out of there. The back door creaked as Jake pulled it open, the cold air rushing in. He glanced over his shoulder one last time to see the two men scrambling to get up. But they were too slow. Jake slammed the door shut behind him and made his way through the alley. The van was just ahead, parked in the shadows, and he could see Lily crouched inside, her eyes wide with fear. He could hear the sound of engines approaching, and he knew Steele wasn't far behind. Jake's hands shook as he grabbed the door handle of the van. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but he knew it wasn't long. He jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. The engine sputtered to life, and Jake put the van into gear. He stepped on the gas, the tires screeching as they tore down the alley. The sound of revving engines echoed in the distance, and Jake knew Steele's crew was right on their tail. But he couldn't think about that now. He had to focus on getting out of there. The van swerved around corners, narrowly avoiding obstacles as Jake pushed it harder. He glanced over at Lily, who was still clutching the blueprint in her hands. She hadn't let go of it once, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice low but steady. Lily nodded silently, her grip tightening on the seat. The van lurched forward as they sped through the streets, the sound of tires squealing in protest. Jake's heart was racing, his mind focused only on one thing: getting them out of this mess. They needed to disappear. He needed to protect her. Jake took a sharp turn, heading toward the outskirts of town. He knew these streets well, and he had a plan. There was a network of old warehouses and backroads that Steele's crew would never think to check. It was their best chance. But as they passed a set of headlights in the distance, Jake's gut twisted. The crew was getting closer. He pushed the van harder, making another sharp turn to throw them off the trail. The headlights behind him dipped for a moment, and Jake felt a brief moment of relief. But it didn't last. The van's engine sputtered again, and Jake's stomach sank. He had pushed it too hard. They couldn't keep this up forever. "Jake, we can't outrun them forever," Lily said, her voice shaking. "We need to stop." Jake's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as he scanned the road ahead. He didn't want to stop. Not yet. But Lily was right. They needed a new plan. Jake pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing. He had to think of something. The crew was closing in, and time was running out. He glanced at Lily, who was staring out the window, her face pale and drawn. He could see the toll it was taking on her. She was just a kid, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. He had to protect her, no matter what. "Stay here," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'll be right back." He quickly got out of the van, leaving the door cracked open. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face as he scanned the area. There was an old abandoned factory up ahead, a place Jake knew well. It was the perfect spot to lay low for a while. He just had to make sure they got there first. Jake moved quickly, his eyes darting between the van and the road. The headlights of Steele's crew were still visible in the distance, but they were fading. Jake's plan was working. He reached the factory entrance and paused for a moment, catching his breath. This was their chance. He turned around and saw Lily still in the van, watching him. He gave her a quick nod before rushing inside. The factory was dark and quiet, the only sound the echo of his footsteps on the concrete floor. Jake quickly found a place to hide, a small room in the back that had been long abandoned. It wasn't much, but it would do. He looked around for anything that could help, anything that could give them a chance. The sound of tires skidding on the gravel outside made Jake's heart race. He couldn't let them find him here. He grabbed a piece of metal from a nearby shelf and wedged it in front of the door, hoping it would hold. Jake turned back to the van and signaled for Lily to come inside. She climbed out of the van hesitantly, her eyes scanning the area. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "We'll be okay," he said, trying to reassure her. He wasn't sure if he believed it himself, but it was the only thing he could say. Together, they moved deeper into the factory, their footsteps muffled by the cold concrete floor. Jake kept his hand on the crowbar he had grabbed earlier, his grip tight. Steele and his crew were getting closer, and they had no idea what they were about to walk into. The factory was quiet, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the occasional creak of metal shifting in the cold. Jake stood at the back of the room, his hand still clutching the crowbar, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could hear the engines getting closer. Steele and his crew were nearby, and Jake knew that they wouldn't stop until they had what they were after. He glanced over at Lily, who was huddled in the corner, her wide eyes filled with fear. She hadn't said a word since they arrived, but Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. This was more than she should have been exposed to, more than any child should have to go through. The weight of that thought sat heavy on Jake's chest. His instincts told him to keep moving, to get them both out of this mess. But where could they go? The factory was the perfect place to lay low for now, but it wouldn't hold up for long. Steele's men would find them eventually. He had to find a way to lose them for good. Jake moved toward the back door, keeping his steps light, careful. Every nerve in his body was on high alert. He couldn't afford to make a sound, couldn't risk alerting anyone to their position. The sound of footsteps outside made him freeze. They were close, too close. He held his breath, trying to quiet his pounding heart. Lily was still in the corner, her eyes locked on him. She wasn't making a sound either. Jake's mind raced. He had to think, had to come up with something fast. The blueprint, the symbols on it. He still didn't fully understand what they meant, but he knew they were connected to something far bigger than either of them. Steele wasn't after just any map. There was power in it, power that Jake couldn't allow to fall into the wrong hands. He had to protect Lily, had to keep her safe at all costs. But in the back of his mind, Jake knew the truth. He was running out of time. The footsteps grew louder, and Jake cursed under his breath. They were right outside now. He grabbed the crowbar tighter, ready for anything. The back door creaked as it opened slightly, and a shadow passed by the crack. Jake's muscles tensed, his mind working in overdrive. He didn't have much time. He had to make a choice. He could confront them now, risk everything in a fight he might not win, or he could wait, stay hidden, and pray they passed by. It was a hard choice, but there was no time to waste. The faint sound of Steele's voice carried through the door. "Jake, we know you're in there. Come out now. You don't have to make this harder than it has to be." The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. Steele knew he was here. There was no running anymore. "You've got nowhere to hide, Jake," Steele's voice continued, growing more insistent. "You can't outrun us." Jake glanced over at Lily, her face pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He couldn't let them get to her. He wouldn't. Jake took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the crowbar. This was it. He was going to face them. He couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to end this. With one swift motion, Jake swung the back door wide open, stepping into the dimly lit hallway of the factory. He had to make it count. The metal beams above him groaned as he moved, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He couldn't hear Steele's men, but he knew they were close. "Jake," Steele called out again, his voice distant but growing louder. "We're not playing games. Come out now, and we'll make it easy for you. Give us the blueprint, and no one has to get hurt." Jake gritted his teeth. The blueprint. Steele's obsession with it was more than just a desire for power. It was about control. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. Not now. Not ever. Jake's eyes scanned the factory floor, looking for anything that could help him. The shadows were thick, but they were closing in. Steele's men would be on him any second. His grip on the crowbar tightened. The sound of footsteps grew closer. He had to be ready. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't afraid, but the adrenaline was real. He had faced danger before, but this was different. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting Lily, and that meant he'd do whatever it took. The first of Steele's men appeared from the shadows, his face illuminated by the weak light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. Jake didn't hesitate. He swung the crowbar, catching the man across the chest. The man staggered back, but Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He advanced, swinging again, knocking the man to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The other two men were right behind him. They weren't going to let this go easily. Jake turned to face them, his heart racing, his body tense. He could see the fire in their eyes, the hunger for the blueprint, for whatever power it promised. But Jake wasn't afraid. He knew how to fight, how to survive. And he wasn't going down without a fight. The two men lunged at him, but Jake was faster. He swung the crowbar again, knocking one of them to the side. The second man grabbed his arm, trying to wrestle the crowbar from him. But Jake twisted free, delivering a hard kick to the man's chest, sending him crashing into a stack of old crates. "You want the map?" Jake growled, his voice low. "You'll have to kill me first." The remaining man lunged at Jake, but before he could reach him, the sound of sirens rang out in the distance. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was their chance. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The sirens were growing louder, and Steele's men were distracted. Jake didn't waste any time. He grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her toward the exit. "Let's go," he said, urgency in his voice. Lily didn't hesitate. She followed him out into the night, and they ran for their lives, knowing that the chase was far from over. They ran through the night, the cold air biting at their skin as Jake pulled Lily along. Their footsteps echoed in the empty streets, but the sound of engines revving in the distance kept them moving faster, pushing them forward. Jake could feel the weight of the blueprint in his jacket, but more than that, he could feel the weight of responsibility. He had to protect Lily, and he had to keep the blueprint safe. If Steele, or anyone from his crew got their hands on it, everything would unravel. He wasn't ready to lose this fight. The sirens were growing louder now, and Jake didn't dare look back. He knew they couldn't outrun the police forever, but for now, the distraction from the sirens was enough to put some distance between them. And Steele's men. He glanced at Lily, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had been through so much already. No child should have to live like this. But here they were, running for their lives. It wasn't right, but there was no other choice. They had to survive. Jake pulled her toward a small alley, hoping to lose their pursuers in the maze of streets. The alley was narrow, lined with old buildings, and the faint glow of a streetlight flickered above them. Jake glanced over his shoulder once more, but saw no one. For a brief moment, they were safe. But Jake knew better than to think it would last. They could never stay in one place for too long. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. Lily nodded, her face still filled with fear, but her grip on his hand was tight. "Where are we going?" she asked. Jake hesitated. He hadn't thought this far ahead. He didn't have a plan beyond getting away from Steele's crew, but now that they had some distance, he realized how much they needed a place to regroup, to figure out their next move. "There's a friend of mine who lives a few miles away," Jake said finally. "He's got a place where we can hide out for a while." He didn't explain more, didn't need to. Lily didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded, trusting him to lead them to safety. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the alley walls. Every now and then, Jake would glance over his shoulder, half expecting Steele's men to appear out of nowhere. But nothing. It was quiet. Too quiet. Jake kept his pace steady, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. He wasn't sure where to go after this. Steele was relentless, and if he was this close now, he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Jake had been through worse, but this was different. Lily's life was on the line. That made everything feel even heavier. As they walked, the city's lights began to blur together. The streets stretched ahead, dark and endless. Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had put Lily in this situation, dragged her into something she couldn't possibly understand. The blueprint was meant to protect her, too. Keep them both safe. But the deeper they got, the more dangerous it became. They were caught in a web of secrets, and Jake didn't know if they'd be able to get out. They reached a quiet residential street, and walked a few blocks before Jake stopped in front of a modest house. The lights were off, but Jake could make out the faint outline of a car parked in the driveway. This was it. He knocked twice, softly, and waited. It wasn't long before the door creaked open. A tall man in his late 40s stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable at first. "Jake," the man said, his voice deep. "What are you doing here?" Jake stepped forward, pulling Lily behind him. "We need a place to stay," he said, his voice urgent. The man looked at them for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Jake didn't hesitate. He ushered Lily inside, closing the door behind them. The man's house was small but comfortable, with soft lighting and old furniture. Jake could feel the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, but the weight of the situation was far from gone. The man led them into a living room, and Jake quickly collapsed into an old chair. Lily sat on the couch next to him, her body still stiff with fear. The man, whose name Jake hadn't yet said, sat across from them. He had an air of quiet authority about him, his face weathered but kind. "You're safe here," the man said, his voice calm. "But you're not safe out there. Not for long." Jake nodded. He had known this wouldn't be a permanent solution, but for now, it was all they had. "Thanks," Jake said, his voice quiet. The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "What's going on, Jake?" he asked, his tone more serious now. Jake hesitated. He had known this man for years, but he wasn't sure how much he should say. He looked over at Lily, who was now curled up on the couch, her eyes closed, but still restless. "It's complicated," Jake said finally, "but I've got something they want, and they're not going to stop until they get it." The man's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, something they want?" Jake took a deep breath. This was the part he had been avoiding, but he couldn't keep it from this man any longer. "I've got a map," Jake said, his voice low. "A blueprint. It's got symbols, codes, things connected to something bigger than I can understand." The man sat back in his chair, his gaze steady. "And they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it." Jake nodded. "They will. And now, they'll come after anyone connected to it." The man didn't say anything for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice firm. "You're not alone in this, Jake. We'll help you, but you need to stay hidden. You need to stay smart." Jake nodded, his body relaxing slightly. The man's words, the quiet reassurance, gave him a sense of hope. They weren't alone anymore. But the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The man, whose name was Sam, didn't ask any more questions after Jake's explanation. Instead, he got up, moved to the kitchen, and began making a pot of coffee. Jake sat in the living room, his mind racing with thoughts of the blueprint, Steele's crew, and the danger that loomed just outside. He glanced over at Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her face still marked by the exhaustion and fear of the past few days. The image of her, so small and vulnerable, kept playing in Jake's mind. He had to keep her safe. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Sam returned with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down in front of Jake. He sat across from him, watching Jake carefully. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Sam said, his voice low. "But we need to figure out what's going on, and fast. Those guys are not going to let up." Jake took a long sip of the coffee, the warmth of the mug a small comfort in the midst of everything. "I know," Jake said, "but I can't do this alone. Steele's crew is just the beginning. Whoever's after this blueprint, they're bigger. They've got more resources, and they won't stop until they get it." Sam nodded, his face grim. "I've seen how these things go," he said. "You start small, but you keep getting dragged into something bigger until there's no way out." Jake sat back, staring into his coffee, lost in thought. He knew Sam was right. This had started out as just a simple mission to find safety. But now it was something much more dangerous. The blueprint was more than just a map. It was a key to something that could change everything. But what was it? And why did Steele want it so badly? "I don't know what's at the end of this," Jake said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "But I can't let them use it. If they get their hands on it, they'll destroy everything." Sam leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You said it's a map. But a map to what? What are these people really after?" Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he knew the full answer himself. All he knew was that the symbols on the blueprint weren't just random. They had a meaning, something far more important than just a route or location. They were connected to a network of people, hidden away for years. And now, someone wanted to uncover that secret. "I don't know," Jake said finally. "But I'm going to find out." There was a long pause as Sam studied him. Finally, Sam spoke. "If you're going to get to the bottom of this, you're going to need more than just hiding out here. We need to start gathering information, find out who else is involved." Jake looked at Sam, his eyes hard. "I don't trust anyone anymore," he said. "I've seen how these things play out. People make deals, and then they turn on you. I can't let that happen." Sam nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. But you can't do this on your own. You're not in this alone anymore, Jake. We'll figure it out together." Jake looked over at Lily again, still sleeping peacefully on the couch. He couldn't let her grow up in this world, a world where secrets and lies were the only currency. He had to stop it before it destroyed everything. "All right, Jake said, finally making up his mind. We'll find out who's behind this and stop them before they get any closer. Sam smiled, but there was no humor in it. Good. But we need a plan. We don't have time to waste, Jake replied. We start by tracking down the people who know about the blueprint, the ones who have been hiding this secret all these years. We find them, and we make sure they don't share it with anyone else. Sam leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. We'll need more than just info. We need leverage, and we need to stay one step ahead of them. Jake looked at Sam. We'll do whatever it takes, he said firmly. Sam didn't respond right away, but Jake could see the understanding in his eyes. They were in this together, for better or worse. Sam stood up, crossing the room and grabbing a phone from the counter. I have some contacts that might be able to help, he said, dialing the number. We'll need a safe place to meet and more resources to track down these people. Jake didn't ask any more questions. They didn't have time for explanations. He watched as Sam spoke on the phone, making arrangements. The plan was in motion. They would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. As Sam hung up the phone, he turned back to Jake. We have a lead. There's a guy who knows something. We'll meet him tomorrow. It's risky, but it's the best we've got. Jake stood up, his jaw clenched. We'll be ready. Sam gave him a nod. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Jake didn't feel like resting, but he knew Sam was right. They needed to regroup, stay focused. He glanced over at Lily once more. She was still asleep, but even in her sleep, she looked fragile, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Jake turned away, his mind already on the next move. He had no idea what would happen next, but he wasn't going to let anyone harm her. Not on his watch. The morning light filtered weakly through the small windows of the house as Jake stood by the door, adjusting his jacket. Sam had made the call the night before, and now they were ready to meet the informant, the man who might hold the key to unraveling the mystery behind the blueprint. The weight of the situation pressed down on Jake as he looked over at Lily, still asleep on the couch. He couldn't bear to wake her up just yet, not when she had been through so much already. He moved quietly to the window, peering out at the street. The city was just beginning to stir. The sound of a distant car horn broke the silence. It was time to go. Jake took a deep breath and walked back to the couch, kneeling down beside Lily. Lily, he whispered gently. We need to go. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked disoriented. The fear that had been present in her eyes for days hadn't gone away, but it was softened by the exhaustion of the past few hours. What's happening? She asked in a small voice. Jake smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We're going to meet someone who can help us, all right? Lily nodded slowly, rubbing her eyes. She was quiet as she stood up, still holding the blueprint in her hands like it was the most important thing in the world. Jake watched her for a moment, the way she held it so tightly, as if it were the only thing that made sense in the chaos they were living. He turned away, grabbing a small bag he had packed the night before. It wasn't much, just a few essentials, but it would have to do. Let's go, he said, taking Lily's hand. They walked out of the house, Sam already waiting outside, his car parked on the curb. The engine hummed softly as he leaned against it, his arms crossed. When he saw Jake and Lily, he pushed himself off the car and opened the passenger door for them. You ready? Sam asked, his voice low but steady. Jake nodded. Let's get this over with. The drive to the meeting spot was tense, the silence between them heavy. Jake's mind was racing, thinking about everything that had happened so far and what was still to come. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Sam took a sharp turn down a narrow road. The buildings grew sparse, the streets quieter. They were headed to a part of town Jake had never been to before. He glanced at Sam. How far is it? He asked. Sam didn't answer right away, but when he did, his tone was different, serious. Not far. The guy we're meeting is a contact of mine. He's reliable, but we don't know what he's going to say. So be ready for anything. Jake nodded. I'll be ready. They pulled up to an old warehouse at the edge of the city. The place looked abandoned, the windows dark, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Jake's heart started to race again. It wasn't the kind of place you went to if you were looking for something good. Sam parked the car and cut the engine. Stay close, he said to Jake, his voice firm. The three of them got out, and Jake led the way toward the warehouse. The heavy scent of rust and damp concrete hit him as they approached the door. Sam knocked twice, a slow and deliberate rhythm. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man inside. He was tall, with graying hair and a hard look in his eyes. His clothes were nondescript, but Jake could tell he wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. "Sam," the man said gruffly. "You brought the kid?" Sam nodded. "She's with me. We need information." The man's eyes shifted to Lily, who was standing behind Jake, clutching the blueprint tightly in her hands. "All right," the man said, stepping aside to let them in. "Let's talk." The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, with crates and boxes stacked everywhere. The air was thick with dust. The man led them to a small table in the back corner, and they all sat down. The man didn't waste any time. "What's this about a blueprint?" he asked, his voice low. Jake hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's a map," he said quietly. "But it's more than that. There are symbols on it. Something bigger is going on. We need to know what it leads to." The man's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his chair. "Symbols, you say?" he repeated, sounding more intrigued than surprised. "Where did you get this map?" "It was given to Lily," Jake replied, glancing at the girl beside him. Lily looked up at the man, her expression guarded. "My mom gave it to me," she said softly. The man's face hardened. "Your mom? What did she say about it?" Lily swallowed hard, her grip on the blueprint tightening. "She said it would protect us," she whispered. Jake could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand what this all meant, but she was caught up in it just the same. The man studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "That blueprint's been around for years," he said slowly. "It's part of something much bigger than you realize. People have died for it, and there are those who'll do anything to get their hands on it." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had known it was dangerous, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. "Who's after it?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. The man sighed. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But I know enough. There are factions, groups, that have been looking for that map for a long time. And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Jake's mind raced. Factions? Groups? This was bigger than he had thought. "What do we do now?" Sam asked, his voice low. The man looked at them both, then back at Lily. "We run. We keep moving. Because if they find you with that map, you won't live long enough to see the next sunrise." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the threat. Jake stared at the man, trying to process what he had just said. "If they find you with that map, you won't live long enough to see the next sunrise." Jake had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about protecting Lily, keeping her safe from forces that would stop at nothing to get their hands on the blueprint. Jake turned to Lily, who was still gripping the blueprint tightly, her small hands trembling slightly. "We can't let them take it," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The man in front of them didn't seem to be surprised by their reaction. Instead, he looked at them both with a mixture of pity and resignation. "It's not just about the map. It's about power. And power never comes without sacrifice," he said quietly. "You're already in this too deep. You need to keep moving, keep hiding. There are no safe places for you anymore." Jake's mind was racing. He had no idea how far this went, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here. Not with Steele's crew still looking for them. Not with whoever was behind this blueprint, this secret, closing in. "Where do we go now?" Sam asked, his voice low, almost defeated. The man sighed deeply. "There's a safe house. It's the best place I can offer you. It's far enough from the city, hidden away. But you have to go now. You can't waste any more time." Jake looked at Lily again. She was just a child, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. He had failed to keep her safe before, and now it was his responsibility to make sure it didn't happen again. "We're going," Jake said firmly, standing up and walking toward the door. "Stay close to me," he told Lily, who nodded, following him without hesitation. Sam stood up too, moving toward the door. "I'll meet you there. You can't trust anyone, but this is the best chance you've got. Go now, and don't look back." They left the warehouse, stepping out into the cool morning air. Jake felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he kept his pace steady. They had to get to the safe house, and they had to make sure no one found them along the way. The drive was tense, the streets still quiet, but Jake's nerves were on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every car, every shadow, every flicker of movement made him jump. He glanced over at Lily, who sat quietly in the back seat, the blueprint still clutched tightly in her hands. Jake tried to keep his focus on the road, but his mind kept wandering back to the blueprint. What did it mean? What was it leading to? And why had it become so dangerous? They didn't have much time to figure it out. The sound of an engine behind them caught Jake's attention. It wasn't just any engine. It was the low rumble of a motorcycle, unmistakable. He could hear it growing louder, closing in fast. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "They're coming," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. Lily looked up, her face pale. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not on these streets. He needed a plan, and fast. "We don't stop," he said, his voice low but firm. "Stay down, stay quiet. And don't let them see you." The motorcycle roared louder, and Jake knew they were almost on top of them. He pushed the pedal to the floor, speeding down the empty streets, turning corners with reckless abandon. The sound of the motorcycle was still behind them, but it wasn't getting closer. Jake was managing to keep ahead. "For now, we're almost there," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. He could see the outskirts of town in the distance, the safe house just beyond. They had to make it there. They had to lose whoever was following them. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror again. The motorcycle was still there, but it was falling behind. The sound of it faded as they turned onto a smaller road leading into the woods. "This is it," Jake said, his eyes narrowing. The safe house was a small cabin, tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by trees. It was the perfect place to hide, hidden from view, far from prying eyes. Jake parked the car behind the cabin, the headlights casting long shadows across the ground. "We're here," he said, turning off the engine. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." They got out of the car and made their way toward the cabin, staying low, moving quickly through the trees. The safe house was small, but it was well stocked. There was a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. Jake had used it a few times in the past, but never for something like this. As they stepped inside, Jake locked the door behind them and drew the curtains. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. For a moment, they were safe. But Jake knew that safety wouldn't last forever. They were still in danger. They still had the blueprint. And Steele and his men were still out there, looking for them. Jake glanced over at Lily, who was now sitting on the couch, her small form curled up in the corner. She looked exhausted, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes. He couldn't let them win. He had to figure out what was going on, what this blueprint really meant. And he had to do it before they came for her. Before they came for both of them.